I was on a ventilator for 9 days after a car accident, and by the time I woke up, my parents had already signed the entire family business over to the brother who hadn't spoken to any of us in 6 years. My name is Callista, and I want to walk you through exactly how that happened, because the timeline gets worse every single time I lay it out in order. This story does not slow down. Stay with me. Fast context, because the pace only accelerates from here. My family owned a mid-sized commercial landscaping and construction supply business, started by my grandfather, built up over decades by my father, and for the preceding 6 years, run day-to-day almost entirely by me. I'd worked my way up from summer labor as a teenager to operations manager to, eventually, the person actually keeping the company functional while my father, in his mid-60s, gradually stepped back from active daily involvement. There had never been a formal, written succession plan. My parents had always talked, informally, about the business eventually being mine, in the way families sometimes discuss inevitable seeming futures without ever putting anything in legal writing, a detail that turns out to matter enormously to everything that happened next. My older brother, Ambrose, had left the business, and largely the family, 6 years earlier, following a bitter falling out with our father over money Ambrose had, at the time, taken from company accounts without authorization to cover a series of his own personal debts. He'd been formally pushed out, cut off from company involvement entirely, and had, in the 6 years since, maintained only sporadic, strained contact with our parents and almost none at all with me. I was in a car accident 11 days before this story starts, a genuinely severe one. Another driver ran a red light, and I spent the following 9 days on a ventilator in an induced coma while doctors managed the swelling and monitored for complications. I want to be honest that the medical details of that period are, understandably, mostly reconstructed for me secondhand, since I was, for the entire relevant window, unconscious. I woke up on the 10th day, disoriented, exhausted, my body still recovering from injuries that would require months of further treatment, and I want to describe the first several hours of consciousness, because they were, understandably, mostly consumed by basic medical reorientation rather than any awareness of what had been happening outside my hospital room during those 9 days. It was my mother, on the second day I was fully lucid, who first mentioned it, almost as an aside, clearly trying to soften something she'd apparently been dreading having to tell me. "We need to talk to you about the business. Once you're feeling a little stronger," she said, in a tone I recognized, even through the fog of recovery, as the specific, careful tone people use right before delivering something they know is going to be difficult to hear. "What about the business?" I said. "Is everything okay? Is it still running?" She hesitated, and I want you to understand that this hesitation, small as it was, is the first moment I registered that something was genuinely wrong, rather than just routine operational concern during my absence. "It's running," she said. "Your father and we had to make some quick decisions while you were in the hospital. Ambrose has been helping." I sat with that sentence for a long moment, my still recovering brain slowly catching up to the specific wrongness of it. Ambrose, who had been formally, deliberately excluded from any involvement in the business for 6 full years, had, apparently, been helping during the exact 9 days I was unconscious and unable to advocate for myself. I want to walk you through what I actually learned over the following week, because it escalated fast, piece by piece, each new detail worse than the last. My father visited the following day, and I asked him directly what had actually happened. What he told me, delivered with what I could tell was genuine discomfort, but not, I would come to understand, genuine remorse. Was this 3 days into my hospitalization? With doctors still uncertain whether I would survive the initial swelling, let alone recover full function even if I did, my parents had made the decision, together, deliberately, with an actual attorney, not some panicked, informal arrangement, to formally transfer majority ownership and operational control of the business to Ambrose, just to make sure someone with the legal authority was there to keep things running while we didn't know what was going to happen with you. I want to describe the specific vertigo of hearing that sentence, still in a hospital bed, still recovering from injuries that had, 3 days into that same hospitalization, apparently prompted my own parents to conclude that my possible death or permanent incapacitation was likely enough to justify formally handing over 6 years of my actual, daily built work to the brother who had stolen from the company and vanished from our lives for the better part of a decade. "I was still alive," I said. "I was in a coma, not dead. You didn't wait to see what would actually happen. You made a permanent legal decision about my entire career 3 days in, based on doctors who were still running tests." My father's answer, which I've turned over many times since, was, "We panicked. Ambrose was the only one available who had any real business experience, and we didn't know how long you'd be out or what state you'd be in if you woke up at all. It felt like the responsible thing to do at the time. I want to be precise about what transferred majority ownership actually meant in practical terms, because the scale of it only became clear to me over the following days as I started reviewing the actual paperwork. Ambrose had not simply been given operational authority to keep the business running smoothly during an emergency, the way you might reasonably designate someone with power of attorney for exactly this kind of crisis. He had been made majority owner, outright, permanently, with a signed transfer agreement that included no provision for reversal once I recovered, no built-in mechanism acknowledging that this was meant as a temporary emergency measure rather than a final, irreversible restructuring of company ownership. I called the family attorney who had apparently drafted the paperwork, a man I'd known for years through the business, and asked him, directly, why he hadn't built in any reversal mechanism given that the entire justification for the transfer was explicitly tied to uncertainty about my medical outcome. His answer, delivered with what I could tell was his own discomfort about the situation, was that my parents had specifically instructed him to draft it as permanent, to avoid ongoing legal complications, rather than as the temporary emergency measure I would have expected and reasonably assumed was the actual intent. I want to tell you what I discovered next, because it reframed the entire timeline yet again. Ambrose, it turned out, had not simply been a passive beneficiary of a panicked decision my parents made independently. He had, according to what the attorney eventually confirmed under my direct, repeated questioning, actually reached out to my parents himself on the second day of my hospitalization, not the third, as my father had initially told me, specifically proposing the ownership transfer, framing it, according to the attorney's notes from that initial call, as being done for Callista's protection, to make sure the business doesn't collapse while she's unable to advocate for herself. I sat with that detail for a long time. My brother, absent for 6 years, estranged over his own theft from the company, had reached out to my parents within 48 hours of my accident, not to ask how I was doing, not to offer emotional support, but specifically to propose a permanent restructuring of company ownership in his own favor, framed with what I can only describe as genuinely audacious language, as an act of protection on my behalf. I confronted Ambrose directly, once I was physically well enough for the conversation, about 10 days after regaining consciousness. He did not deny the timeline, which somehow made it worse rather than easier to process, because it meant he'd apparently accepted, going in, that I would eventually learn the full sequence of events and had decided the outcome was worth that risk. I saved the business, he said, with a directness that genuinely stunned me. You were in a coma. Nobody knew if you were coming back or what kind of shape you'd be in if you did. Someone needed to actually run things, and I was the only person in this family with the actual experience to do it. You stole from this company 6 years ago, I said. That's the entire reason you weren't already part of it. And the first thing you did when I couldn't defend myself was ask our parents to hand you permanent ownership. He didn't have a genuinely good answer for that, though he tried, over the following weeks, several different versions of self-justification that all amounted, essentially, to the same core claim, that the ends, the business continuing to operate during my hospitalization, justified whatever means had been used to get there, regardless of how that outcome had been engineered or who had been cut out of the process entirely. I want to tell you about the legal fight that followed, because it took considerably longer and was considerably more difficult than I expected going in. Because the transfer had been executed with an attorney, properly documented, and signed by both of my parents, the legal owners at the time, fully within their rights to make ownership decisions about a business that was, prior to any of this, still technically theirs. Reversing it was not the straightforward process I'd initially hoped for. My own attorney explained, carefully, that the strongest legal argument available to me wasn't actually about the fairness of the situation, which courts generally aren't positioned to adjudicate on its own, but about the specific circumstances and timeline of the decision, the fact that it had been made while I was unconscious and unable to be consulted or represented, initiated by the exact family member with a documented prior history of financial impropriety toward the company, executed unusually quickly and structured, unusually, as permanent rather than provisional despite the explicitly emergency-driven justification given for it. The legal process took, ultimately, just over a year. I want to skip through most of the actual litigation, because it was, like most legal processes, mostly slow, grinding, and considerably less dramatic than the initial discovery, depositions, document review, expert testimony about standard practices for emergency business succession planning. What I do want to tell you is the outcome, because I think it matters. The court ultimately found in my favor, ruling that the circumstances of the transfer, specifically its permanence despite an explicitly temporary, emergency-based justification, combined with Ambrose's documented history and his active role in initiating the transfer rather than merely accepting it, constituted sufficient grounds to void the agreement and restore the ownership structure to what had existed prior to my hospitalization. I want to tell you about my relationship with my parents during this period, because it was, in many ways, the hardest part of the entire ordeal, harder even than the legal fight with Ambrose himself. I understood, intellectually, that they had made their decision in a moment of genuine panic and fear about losing me. I don't doubt that the fear was real. But understanding the fear didn't fully undo the fact that they had, within 72 hours of my accident, been persuaded to permanently, irreversibly restructure 6 years of my actual work and legal ownership in favor of the one family member with a documented history of betraying that same business, without a single conversation with me, without waiting to see how my recovery would actually unfold, without building in any mechanism at all for me to have a voice in the decision once I woke up. My relationship with my parents has recovered, slowly, over the roughly 18 months since all of this began, though I want to be honest that it's a different relationship now than it was before, one with considerably more explicit boundaries, considerably more insistence, on my part, on having things formalized in writing rather than left to informal family understanding, a lesson I don't think I would have needed nearly so starkly if not for everything that happened during those 9 days. My relationship with Ambrose has not recovered, and I don't currently expect it to. I want to be honest that I don't think that's a loss I particularly grieve. The version of him I might have reconciled with, eventually, under different circumstances, is not the version who spent the second day of my medical coma calling our parents to propose taking permanent ownership of something I'd spent 6 years building. I started therapy about 4 months into the recovery process, once the acute physical rehabilitation had progressed enough to leave room for it. My therapist has helped me sit with something I didn't have language for in the early months, that the specific, compounding nature of what happened, surviving a genuinely life-threatening accident, only to wake up and discover that the exact vulnerability of that recovery period had been actively used against me by people I trusted completely, required its own particular kind of processing, one that doesn't map cleanly onto either straightforward medical trauma or straightforward family betrayal on their own. I think, more than anything, about that first conversation with my mother, the careful, hesitant tone she used before telling me Ambrose had been helping, and how completely that single sentence undersold the scale of what had actually happened during the 9 days I'd been unconscious and unable to protect anything at all. It's been about 18 months now since the accident. My father said something to me a few months after the legal case resolved that I still think about often. He said, "We told ourselves we were protecting the business. I think, if I'm honest, we were really just scared, and fear makes people move faster than they should, toward whoever seems most available in the moment, without stopping to ask whether available and right are actually the same thing." I've thought about that a lot since. I think it's the closest either of my parents has come to fully naming what actually happened, and I think it's the thing that's ultimately let me rebuild some version of a relationship with them, even while I've had to accept that the relationship with my brother is probably gone for good. If you've ever woken up from a medical crisis to discover that your own vulnerability had been used, deliberately, by someone in your life to advance their own interests while you had no ability to object, I want to hear about it. I think there's something particularly disorienting about betrayals that happen specifically during the windows when we're least able to defend ourselves, and something important about the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding what was taken during exactly those windows, piece by piece, once you're finally able to fight for it again. 9 days. One signature. That's all it took for 6 years of my own work to almost belong to someone else entirely.